Welcome to the HR Uprising podcast. This highly practical podcast series explores HR and management hot topics and challenges through conversations with relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Brought to you by Actus software, our aim is to build a better workplace for people. The HR Uprising is about collaborating and supporting each other to build the confidence and skills to rise up to each challenge and deliver real, lasting business value. You can find out more at hruprising.com or join our LinkedIn community. Now introducing your host, chartered psychologist, best-selling author, entrepreneur and speaker, Lucinda.
Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast. I just thought I'd jump on and give you a little introduction to this week's episode. So this week we talked with Ross Garner of Emerald Works, who is a real expert in the learning space. He's been an instructional designer for many years. He's now head of learning experience, and he's got a wealth of experience, and not least that, he's also the host of the Good Practice podcast, which you may have come across, which has been running for an incredible 4 years and is full of great information if you're interested in learning, performance and the workplace. So I was really honoured that he joined us on the podcast this week. He's great fun, he's great laugh, and I hope that you will get lots out of this and be able to go along with the rapport. I wanted to jump on and apologise, however, in advance of setting the episode live with you. I found it virtually impossible to edit because there was a level of banter between us. We really enjoyed each other's company. However, I wouldn't say it was my best interviewing experience ever. So I dare say, as listeners, you may have heard worse. But I felt I was full of cold and was frankly a bit giddy. So apologies in advance if it's less than coherent here and there. I do hope still you'll get some real value out of the podcast because Ross has so much value to bring. Thanks for listening.
Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast. I feel in awe today as I've got such an experienced podcaster with me. I'm delighted that I've got Ross Garner, who's Head of Learning Experience from Emerald Works. And many of you who listen to this may be familiar with him as the host of the super long-running Good Practice podcast. So 4 years, that makes me feel like a complete infiltrator, I guess. Welcome, Ross. Thanks for coming on. Do you want to just tell the audience, if anyone hasn't come across the Good Practice podcast, obviously introduce yourself and just tell them a bit about that podcast too, because they might enjoy it.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for inviting me on your show, Lucinda. Obviously, you are a chart-topping show, which we have never achieved. So I'm the one that's in awe. We started about 4 years ago, almost 4.5, May 2016. Basically, at what was then Good Practice, the company that's now Emerald Works, there was a small subset of people who were really into podcasts and thought it sounded quite easy to produce one because all you really need to do is have a conversation with someone and record it and then slap some music on it, and job's a good one. So May 2016, we gathered around a table, we recorded the conversation, we edited it a little bit, put a theme song on it, put it on the internet, and we panicked and thought, oh no, now we need to do another one next week. We've foolishly committed to doing a podcast every week. That was quite a lot of stress. It took ages, it took 8 hours, I think, to edit the first episode. We didn't know what we were doing. It sounds terrible. It's still online. You can go and listen. I'm the first voice you hear, and it's incredibly amateurish. And then over the past sort of 4.5 years, we've done, I think, 220 episodes. So we've done one every week since then. We take a little break for Christmas. And the kind of focus of it, which we've come to after about 6 months to get to this point, I think probably, is work performance and learning. So we're interested in, so how is work changing? How can we help people perform at work? What role does learning play? And then that's kind of broad enough to bring in anything that we want to talk about. It's been a really nice opportunity to find people who are experts in their field and ask them kind of invasive personal questions about their job and their experience and learn from them. So it's been the ideal CPD for me as well the whole time. I get to speak to the likes of you.
It does force you to learn, doesn't it? And I think the reason it's relevant for listeners, if you're wondering why we're chatting about this, is the whole focus of this episode is really about learning. How do we help people learn? And obviously what you do for a job, Ross, other than your podcast, which is just a small part of it, is all about designing learning and being ahead of learning, I guess, in terms of that's your role, really. I mean, what as head of learning experience, what do you do at Emerald Works?
Yeah, so my job title used to be instructional designer. So I would make e-learning courses. And when I started sort of 7 years ago, something like that, it was typically hour-long e-learning courses with a lot of instruction in there. There's been a shift, I think, away from that. No one really at work has an hour to dedicate to anything, let alone like an e-learning resource. So we've started to create content, I guess, that normally takes around 5 to 15 minutes to complete. There might be playlists of content, so it's not like you don't have still a great depth and breadth of stuff getting produced. It's just broken up into a way that's a lot more user-friendly, that works with the flow of work. And the transition to the title learning experience rather than instructional design reflects that we're not necessarily caring if anyone learns anything anymore. We might want them to develop an interest in something, or we might want to give them a resource that helps them do their job. Don't care if they remember it or not. They can refer to that resource every single time. And so instruction is less important, learning experience more so. I hope that makes sense.
It does make sense, but I'm going to have to ask follow-up questions on that as someone whose background was in training. So what you're saying is it doesn't matter if people learn stuff anymore, or as long as they have a good experience.
It depends, right? So will be, let's say, objective setting, for example. That's like a task that managers have to do with their direct reports all the time. Okay, do they need to learn how to set objectives? Probably helps if they know it, but when they approach that task, which they might do on like an annual basis, it'd be really useful if there were some resources that they could look at that would help them do that. So maybe some like, what does a good objective look like? Or some questions you could ask to get their direct reports to reflect on what they've done last year and what they might want to do next year. They don't necessarily need to learn and remember these things. They can refer to it when it comes round. And that's true of everything.
Yeah. Okay, it's not about the experience, it's having the right information when you need it in order to have a better output. So I can see that that's more output related in principle. If you can access the information and do a better job, then that will support your outputs as long as you access the information, as opposed to I could go through and pass the test of what SMART stands for, but it doesn't mean I'll write a better objective or work.
Exactly. So have you actually learned anything doing that test? Like
of note.
Maybe you have learned it, and are you going to remember it in a year's time when you have to do it again? Kind of seems unlikely. On the experiential side, if you look at something like health and safety training, like people always find this really boring and they don't really care. But it is important. You do want people to behave differently and to take certain steps to protect themselves and others. So the experience side is how can we create an experience, and in my job, it's a digital experience, to make people care about it. So one option might be to set their building on fire. Now, suddenly health and safety seems really important to them, but that's like a dramatic approach. So another way you could do it might be to like do an interview with someone who has been in that situation. They could talk about how they felt going through that, the actions they did, mistakes that were made that could have been prevented. And that's a kind of experience, an emotional experience, really, that's going to resonate with people and make them think, oh, this thing I didn't care about a minute ago, actually, I do need to pay more attention, and I do need to maybe think about this in my day-to-day work.
So it's a slightly more subtle approach to getting people to want to take that information on. And actually, I'd like to go on to that in a moment, actually, about how we get people to want to learn. Because that was one of the questions, a few months ago, doesn't it? I've asked you and other people in a similar field, David James, on a podcast about a year ago. So this whole thing about e-learning, old school, e-learning versus learning experience, or e-learning platforms, learning management systems versus learning experience platforms. I think maybe from what you've described there, it does sound like maybe I understand a bit more the subtleties of the difference there, but would you explain that? Because I think it's for people who are listening to this, quite a lot of them are not going to be learning experts, and a lot of them are maybe an HR person who's standalone and has also got this as part of their people hat. What is the difference, and how would you advise there?
So it might be useful to talk about maybe the way that we would approach a typical project and how we kind of end up at the output that we're talking about and whether it's going to be a learning output or not. So oftentimes like a client will come to us and they'll say, we've got this slide deck. This is particularly the case now that COVID's going on. We used to do this as a stand-up session, or this is a policy document and it's, runs to 30 pages long. We want people to know this. So can we turn that into some sort of e-learning course?
So what they really mean is do more than read it, basically, or prove they've read it, right?
I guess that's what they mean. There's a notion, and I think if you don't work in learning, it's quite a common notion that if you tell people stuff, they'll remember it in whatever format that might be. And that's not really true. You might remember bits of it. You'll probably remember the bits that you're particularly interested in or are relevant to your job role, but a lot of it's just going to go right over your head. So the way that we start is always to say, let's set that material to the side for a moment. And what is it that you want to achieve? What's the problem that you're trying to solve? Or what is the thing that people aren't doing that you want them to do? Okay, once we've defined that, what's the way that we could... Yeah, exactly. What's the way that we could address that? So people don't care about this thing. How can we pitch it in such a way or create some sort of media or something that encourages them to care by building empathy or connecting it to their circumstance or making them see the relevance of it to their job? Or if they don't actually need to learn it at all, what resources can we build that are going to help them do their job? So like, for example, we did a course with some salespeople. They had to nominate clients that they could take to a workshop to talk about products. And they were, in this case, consistently bringing the wrong people. So the wrong client, or it wasn't the decision maker or so on. So we could have done some training on how you do that, but instead we made like a wizard kind of thing, like a workflow. So you would go through and answer questions on screen. And at the end of it, it would spit out, here's the ideal person that you should bring to this workshop based on your answers. That's not something they need to learn. They can use that every time they need to bring someone to the workshop.
So that was a repeatable, a repeatable way of supporting that. So
tool.
Yes, yeah. Okay, cool. So going back to this sort of learning experience thing. So with these learning experience platforms, is this the same as curation? So what you were saying there about you were gathering people information, is it about enabling people to have the information available should they choose to use it? Of course, it feels like it's a little bit less paternalistic than perhaps our old way of you must do this and get the tick to have completed that e-learning. Is that the idea?
Yeah, it's to an extent. So I have mixed feelings about learning experience platforms and also about curation. So learning
These are just words
platform...
I pick out, so by all means enlighten me.
I think the learning experience platform is a great idea. It's a response to learning management systems. So learning management system is a tool for an admin to administer training content, basically, either digital content or face-to-face workshops or so on. But it tends to be designed with the admin in mind. So how can I make it easy for the admin to do this? Often at the expense of the end user, who in this case is the learner. So a learning experience platform takes it from the other side and says, what if we put the users at the heart of this? How could we create a platform that's really going to help connect users with the content that they need? And the admin side is a bit of a secondary consideration. I think what happens in practice is that there's no clear split. There are learning management systems that actually have a really good learner experience. And there's LXPs that actually have a really good admin experience. And one of the difficulties I think that the LXPs have seen is clients still have compliance and regulatory needs, and they want to track learning. And once you need to do that, you kind of need to get into the LMS space. And so LXPs are kind of turning back into LMSs slightly. So that's one side of it. That's probably confuses everyone completely.
Well, some of it's about marketing then, but yeah, but people do need.
It is kind of
both.
Marketing. Yeah. I mean, you could get a good LMS, you could get a good LXP. There's examples of good in both sides. And then on curation, I think that's sometimes seen as, wouldn't it be cheaper if we just curated some resources? We don't need to make anything from scratch. Sure, that is cheaper as long as you can find it. And I think if you're going to say to someone, could you spend 5 minutes finding 30 resources on difficult conversations? That's not going to be an effective way to do it. You really need to spend a bit of time to find resources that are actually going to be useful for the people that you're trying to support.
Because you just get a lot of quantity. It's not necessarily quality, don't you? Anyone, well, Google, you could argue, is a curation tool. It's just whether or not you know what you need to go and find to.
Google's probably the curation tool that a lot of people are using. But so it depends. How can you best support the people in your organization so that they can perform more effectively?
So I get that. So that assumes, and going back maybe to the paternalistic thing, being a bit cynical. I mean, certainly with e-learning and things like that, the reality is people that sort of stuff, a lot of the time they will do that because they have to. So it's a compliance-driven requirement. They'll go through something, you need to be able to track it. I'm not sure that they wake up in the morning and think, yay, I want to learn about the conduct rules or whatever, the health and safety. But so that's a necessary requirement. Lots of people think they want to learn, but finding the time to learn. So it's almost, I'm thinking, so if you create, doesn't matter how much lovely stuff you've created and you've invested in an LXP or a learning management platform and lots of lovely e-learning, how do you, or resources, whatever the other term, what do you call what you're doing if it's not curated content then? If it's not e-learning,
so we don't curate content because most of what we're doing is created from scratch, and it's normally targeted at a really specific need. So that's where it goes back to that the needs analysis. So what's the problem that you're trying to solve? If there's not something you can find on Google, then we're probably creating something from scratch. So I mean, it might be a course. Digital learning experience, some clients call it that because they don't want to use the word e-learning. Infographics, videos, whatever it could be. Okay, so it's a variety of content, some of which might be e-learning. But the point is, how do you get people to actually want to do it or do it? You might even think, oh, I really do want to learn, but finding the time to do it. Have you got any advice for how people can make that happen? Yeah, so people do want to learn. I think, you made that point yourself. People always say, oh, I want to learn at work. I just don't have the time for it. So you don't really need to worry about the motivation of people wanting to learn, because I think the motivation's there. It's just that they've got other pressures that are getting in the way. So, one way to do it is if you look at the Decky and Ryan, I could give you some show notes that you can add for the kind of relevant papers here, but extrinsic motivation, you can reward people or punish them for learning. That's not, I think, the most effective approach because they're not trying to learn for its own sake. So it makes it difficult to learn if all you're actually wanting to do is click the buttons in the order required to get the little bonus or whatever it might be, or to avoid some form of punishment. But people are intrinsically motivated to learn all the time. And the Decky and Ryan paper I'll share with you is self-determination theory. This is not a new idea, but basically people were motivated by the need for competence, autonomy, and relatedness. So they want to be good at their job. They want to be able to perform it without any help, if possible. And they want to be able to do what others can do. That's the relatedness side of it. So how can we create stuff that helps people do their jobs better and make it easier for them to do things? And ask the people that you work with, what are the challenges that they face, and how could we help you overcome that? What is the who's the person that knows all the answers and constantly gets asked loads of questions? That person's probably got a good idea about the stuff that people need to do their job better. Another thing that we've seen, one of our clients does this, is they have a page on their intranet for the learning and development team. There's a form you can fill in with your learning need. But above that, they've got their top 10 most requested things with links to relevant resources. So before you ask us, have you looked at all this other stuff that we've created that other people have asked and that they found valuable? So that's the solving problems bit. Yeah. For the stuff that you were talking about, how can we make people learn something that they don't care about? I like the Nick Shackleton-Jones book, How People Learn. He talks about his affective context theory. Now, Nick gets some criticism because this hasn't really been tested, but I think it's a useful way of thinking about it. And that's how do we make people care? So how can we connect with people on an emotional level to make them care about the thing that we want them to learn? Okay. I could keep going, but I'm conscious I've talked for a while. Yeah, no, I used to work with Nick Shackleton-Jones. I have to check out that book. Sounds like an interesting context. So how do you actually get people to want to care about it, which makes sense. The stuff you care about or are interested in, the emotional connection is going to motivate you more so. I can see that. And the time, I think we put the time thing to one place. So the linking though maybe to what people want to achieve. You said the expectancy theory and the self-determination, and a lot of that links to engagement. So what I was thinking about. Yeah. So actually, where people are engaged, then
there's potentially here, therefore, a link between learning and engagement. And actually that would be sensible, because one of the questions in the Gallup 12 is about, am I learning and growing? So, but this concept that you're actually feeding the autonomy, feeding people's ability to be autonomous makes sense, doesn't it? So if you can give people this information, they can then do it, they can be more autonomous. It feels like that should be particularly relevant now as well, because we are all having to work remotely. And I suppose, does that mean right now that it's more important than ever to have this? I mean, it's probably a no-brainer question, isn't it? Are you seeing that people are more keen to have online learning and stuff like that as a result of lockdown, and we're going into another lockdown? Do you see that there's a shift in the market?
Yeah, we've seen some spikes in the usage of our products. So starting at the start of lockdown, we saw spikes in content around well-being. I think people just generally found it stressful. I think we'll find it again. I mean, we're recording this, it's the Friday of the US election. I certainly feel a degree of stress. And so there's we've definitely seen that reflected. During the Black Lives Matter resurgent, a lot of our content on diversity and inclusion was visited. Yeah. So I mean, people see these things happening in the news and around them, and they're hungry to learn about these issues. So then the question is just, how can we make it easy for them to take action on that motivation? So like, I mean, this is an HR audience, right? So
yes.
Does your organization permit people to ask questions? Like, is it okay for someone to say, I don't know the answer to this? Now, that partly that's like the way that people relate to one another, but another way that you can create that impression is to constantly be pushing out learning materials and to link to learning materials wherever it's useful. So this is another reference I'll give you, Nudge by Thaler and Sunstein. So this is Nudge Thaler. How can you make it easy for people to do the right thing? And that's where I'm talking about earlier on with, like, if you've got like an objective setting month, can you provide resources to people so that they can do that better? Which doesn't just help them do it. It also creates a culture where you expect people to need help. You're not just saying to people, go and do this, and we expect you to already know this. By providing resources that support that, you're saying, we need you to do this, but we don't expect you to be totally proficient right at the get-go. So it's okay if you need help. And then you can get into like social learning and communities of practice and these kind of things that can help. But from the Emerald Works point of view, we tend to look at resources because that's what we do.
That's an interesting one, actually, with things like objective setting and stuff like that, which actually everyone kind of knows smart, let's say, but actually the ability to write a quality objective, more people can't do it than can. And so how do you actually make it, yet they might feel that it's too difficult to ask for help, or they shouldn't ask, it's too embarrassing to ask for help because they should know, because they know what the acronym stands for.
Right?
So that's an interesting switch. So making it safe to, this is something we always need to hone, we always need to practice, and you would expect to want to check that with somebody. It can always be improved. That's that kind of learning. Is that a growth mindset? We've avoided that term. We were going to talk about that before, but I guess it is that whole sort of thing. It's okay. It's not to fail. It's okay to think it's about growth and learning.
Yeah, I think learning culture is like, it's almost like an organizational growth mindset. It's like the way that we do things around here is that we're interested and we want to solve problems, which is generally how people go through life anyway. That can just be stifled, I think, quite easily if the culture doesn't let you do it. It's not safe for you to ask a question because people will laugh at you or snark, or they'll criticize you or whatever it might be. Or you
get things wrong. It doesn't feel safe if you got something wrong and you made a mistake.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is a mistake. Is it something to be punished, or is it something to learn from? Hopefully you see it as something to be learned from.
One of the things I wondered earlier, and the link to how do you incentivize or how do you motivate people to get this sort of intrinsic or extrinsic motivation? Is that where gamification fits in, or is that just a jargon thing as well? Is that making people have competitions?
I mean, none of these things are like, L&D is a jargon-filled realm. There's an awful lot of, and often it's like the same stuff that gets branded with different words every couple of years. Gamification is like really effective. In fact, if you want to learn how to develop any kind of learning experience, like go and play any video game right now, because the first few levels will increasingly get more and more difficult. Like all you have to do in the first stage is walk forward, and then task 2 is walk forward while swinging your sword, and then task 3 is walk forward while swinging your sword and jumping. And you might unlock points for doing this. So like gamification is really effective. It's a really good way to learn. I think the problem comes when you don't give it any thought whatsoever. So like bear in mind, like a lot of these games are developed with like multi-million-dollar budgets. If you're like one person coming up with like, what are the game mechanics here? If you're going to say like, I don't know, if you access a resource, you get 50,000 points. Like, what does 50,000 points mean? I've got no idea. Is that more or less than other people? So like if you have a leaderboard, maybe you can see how you compare with others. That gives you a kind of a bit of context for it. If there's some sort of rewards attached to it, that could be cool. That could encourage me to do stuff. But maybe going back to the extrinsic motivation, that's encouraging me to do the wrong thing, because all it's encouraging me to do is to click on loads of links, get lots of points, and then I get a reward. So, I mean, gamification, yeah, it is motivating. Is it motivating you to do the right thing? I think you have to think about it.
And not going to get addicted, because thinking that there must be, so if you have something, you get a badge for having done it. You see, you've done your training, and that's nice to get a little dopamine hit because you've achieved something. That's all good, but it's not so good if people then that's all they do. I think when I did the webinar on learning culture, someone said that they had someone in their organization that it was so effective, the gamification, that all they were doing all week was learning, which rather than doing their job. So it's a little bit counterproductive. So I guess you've got to have the balance in place.
I've heard that example as well. We were working with someone in the US. They provided points via they had an LMS, an app version of their LMS that anyone could access outside of work hours, and they got points for doing it. But in the US, in this sector, you had to pay people if they worked outside of their hours, so they had to turn it off because it was getting too expensive. The people were just chasing points all the time. And were they actually learning anything? This is the reason that we do this stuff, is to help people do their jobs better, not necessarily to have fun.
Not necessarily, but nice if you can do it along the way. So yeah. I suppose moving forwards then, in terms of for messages to HR, and some of it is about how how learning has changed, but also maybe messages to HR who are non-L&D professionals, let's say that they haven't got lots of resource available to address learning, but they really want to encourage learning, proportionate learning in their organizations. What are your recommendations to them? You've already talked about risk, which I think is make it safe. So culturally make it safe for people to make mistakes and do your nudging there. Is there anything else that you'd recommend?
Well, I'd expand on the nudge side of it. I would recommend everyone read Nudge, because I think it's a great book, and it's got a handy acronym of things that you should consider. But basically, just assume that all your learners are really busy and they don't have time for anything extra, and they're lazy. And I don't mean lazy as a negative thing. I mean lazy as in all areas of life, people tend to do the easiest thing. So I mean, like the example is like the design of a door. So if you're walking up to a door in Starbucks or something and you see a handle on it, you'll probably try and pull it. And see, when you pull it and it almost yanks your arm off because the handle's on the wrong side of the door, that's a poorly designed door. But people have done the easy thing, which is gone, I see a handle, I'm going to pull it. So what you want to have is a handle on the side that you pull and a flat panel on the side that you push. It's referred to as a Norman door. This is like a 30-year-old concept. But you design the door in a way that tells people what it is that they want to do. And I think it's the same with learning. Like, just assume like everything that you're doing is going to be sending a message to people about the expectation that you have. And so how can you design what you're doing in such a way that it encourages the right behavior? So, for example, if you want people to create SMART goals, I'll just go back to it because we keep talking about it. Why don't you have your SMART goal form next to a little checklist that has the acronym of it? Make it easy for them to do SMART goals. Don't make it difficult by not giving any support. If you want them to do their like health and safety training or whatever it is, and it's in an LMS, but you need to have a different password to the LMS that you might have to reset. And then once you get in, it's buried in a few different menus. And you have to click a box to open it. It pops up, and then you have to click another box to open it again. Like, every single one of those little bits of difficulty is an opportunity to put people off. So assume that people are lazy and will do the easiest thing. Can you just give them one link that opens the course? And then once they're in the course, can you design it in such a way that it surprises them or delights them or makes them care about this thing, creates some sort of emotional response so they don't assume they're coming in thinking it's going to be shit. Can I swear? I have. So assume that they're coming in with really low expectations, and then counter those expectations with something that's really surprising and delightful.
What would be an example of that you could do as an L&D person? Because that sounds a bit about the design.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
I suppose select well-designed stuff.
Yep. Don't necessarily go for the cheapest, like click next health and safety course that you can find. We've done stuff with, we've done like animations, like storytelling. We've done videos of people sharing their experiences. I mean, you can even do it as text. You could just tell a text story with some nice graphics that surprises people, but also relates what they're learning to their context. Again, because people were lazy, you make it easier for them to apply what they're learning. Don't make it seem like really abstract.
Yeah, that makes sense. And actually, I will give your content a bit of a plug here, because we've recently partnered with you guys in terms of making your Emerald Works provision available to people who want to use it through our platform. But the reason I'm mentioning that is when I looked at it, I thought it was very different from my perception of e-learning. It's kind of got the sort of pop imagery to it, and it's a bit of a wow. And I was like, wow, e-learning has definitely come on from my perception of what it was like 25 years ago. So that is what you're saying, is almost give people a bit of a surprise where they're expecting something that's, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was. So look at whatever your provision is. No, it's always going to be. Sorry,
that's what we were going for, Lucinda. Not as
I didn't have any views about what your content was going to be like. It was just more my perception of e-learning from 25 years ago. I thought it had moved on a lot, and this was quite paradigm shifting for me because it looks completely different. May not appeal to everybody in terms of, maybe it's also about choosing the right, having a range of styles, because not all demographics would like the same style. But certainly I get where you're saying there. It was had a bit of a it wasn't what I was expecting in terms of your traditional content there.
And then once people are in, people are generally curious and intrigued by things that are new or novel. But I think it's worth bearing that in mind as well. It's almost like if you can get that initial hook and then encourage people to explore, then you're just going to have a more engaged audience. I mean, the way that e-learning is traditionally designed runs counter to that, which is you're not allowed to explore. You have to go through in a linear fashion, and there's a voiceover that reads everything on screen to you, and you can read faster than the voiceover. So within like 30 seconds, you read the whole page. You're just sitting there waiting for the voiceover to end. Like that's
what I was expecting. Yeah, I remember that. So.
Exactly. That just crushes motivation. Like, we don't even trust you to read this. We're going to read it to you, and we're going to make you suffer through it. Respect your learners. Like, make it easy for them and give them something that they're going to be intrigued by.
Okay, that sounds good.
And
brilliant.
useful stuff.
Yeah, genuinely useful. And I suppose listen to your learners and maybe freshen it up. Do you recommend people change the content or keep it stable? Do people tend to do that? Do they keep the same things coming through?
It depends on the need, right? It's like, has the problem changed? I'd be going back to that.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Rob Breener would be really not impressed with that question. I might edit it out. Good point. Let's go back to the fact it does depend what you need, which is what this is all about. So it's not just learning for learning's sake. It's actually about making sure that we've got the provision there for people, but maybe in a different format to how they had it previously, particularly with a remote remote setup. So old school classroom training is really not going to be around, I don't think, for quite a long time. So it is more about finding other ways of doing it.
Yeah. I mean, on your point, like, would we change things? Like, some of our clients will have they'll have a regulatory need to go through some sort of learning content every year. The default is to make everyone go through the whole thing again. But one way that you can kind of adapt it in the second year, maybe you have an assessment, a pre-assessment at the start. And if people demonstrate that they already know or can do all the things that you're going to cover in whatever this content is, maybe that's enough to accredit them.
Yeah.
And you can, again, it's about respecting learners.
Yes, treating people like adults, really.
Yeah, exactly. And moving away from the notion that if we just tell people stuff over a very long time in forensic detail, they'll remember all of it, because they won't.
They really won't. Well, okay. Well, I think that's probably a good point to end on, particularly seeing as we've managed to get a swear word in this episode, and you've just pointed out to me the real basics. So hopefully that will wash over people. But as ever, Ross, it's always great fun to have you on a podcast. It was great when I was lucky enough to come on your podcast. Thank you for doing. You gave me some references there, didn't you, to people who might want to read further on this if you want to go into the actual sort of papers and evidence. So I'll put those in the show notes because you've kindly dug those out for us. So I think I probably, unless there's any final points, have you got any final takeaways, Ross?
No, it's lovely to speak to you.
And you.
I hope it was useful and not too rambling.
No, I think you were useful. I was rambling, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. So brilliant. Thank you so much for coming on the HR Uprising podcast, Ross. If people want to get hold of you, I know you're active on social media and things like that. What's the best way for them to get hold of you?
Yep, you can tweet me at Ross Garner EW, or you can email me at rgarner@emerald.com. That's
brilliant.
RGARNER.
No full stop. Brilliant. And we'll put those on the show notes as well. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Lucinda.
Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising, proudly brought to you by Actus Software, the joined-up performance and talent management solution. You can access links to any of the information or resources mentioned in the show via the podcast page at www.hruprising.com. If you like what we do, please subscribe, tell your colleagues, and leave a review. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising.